his belt in Berlin. He won the International Jury Prize with a film called Comme le Feu. So once again, I've said it many times before, but if it was still Canada, it was the best foreign film. But these are Quebec creators, producers, artists who have Canada do well internationally, like in many areas. We've talked about this in the House before, but soon we won't have that opportunity. We'll be independent within 4 or 5 years, and our artists, when they do well at the César or at the Oscars or at Cannes, will be in the name of Quebec that they will prizes. But we'll still mention you when we're on the international stages. We'll say, thank you, Canada. You contributed a bit to, how would I say it? To our international reach. So thank you. So to get back to what we have before us, I'm always a little uncomfortable with this type of bill. Quebec is about progressivism. We've said it before, and we'll say it again. An anti-replacement worker law has existed in Quebec for 50 years. We settled this 50 years ago for workers who aren't under federal jurisdiction. 50 years. If Quebec were independent, all Quebec workers now would be protected by this law. There wouldn't be any replacement workers, any scabs. But once again, like in many areas, I've said it before in this House, Quebec is the province where there is the most social housing. There's a housing crisis. Why? Because the government of Quebec, when the federal government stepped out, the government of Quebec stepped up and created a social housing program. And so today, the crisis is a little less bad than elsewhere in the country. There are collateral effects. This will be one of the main causes of inflation in housing in the coming years. Interprovincial immigration. People who leave from Vancouver, from Toronto, who come to Gatineau and then Montreal, because it's a little less expensive to find a place to live. We have a housing crisis in Quebec as well. There are 10,000 homeless people on the street. 10,000. I'll talk about that a little later on too. Because homelessness has gone up. It has doubled over 5 years. The government opposite, the only program it has to help homeless people will be cut by 3%.
3%. You'll say it's not so bad, 3%. It's just a little. But when you think of the housing crisis and you think of single mothers who are sleeping in their cars in Trois-Rivières and immigrant families who thought that it would be heaven here, but who are sleeping in a tent near a river in Saint-Jérôme, how can you accept that? Can't accept it. And there'll be 3% taken away. Why? Because they want to show the Conservatives that they can be rigorous when it comes to the budget. And that's why they're failing the most vulnerable. It makes no sense. Which province in Canada is there the least greenhouse gases produced? Which province? In a very poorly performing countries, when it comes to all the indicators, Canada is coming in last. We're a failing student here. We think of the IMF study in 2022 that said that Canada spent $5 billion on the oil and gas, 50 direct and indirectly invested in the oil and gas industry. How can this happen at a time when there is such homelessness? We have to build thousands of social housing units, but then there's huge profits at CIBC. People are sleeping on the streets at the same time. Single parents and single mothers are victims of domestic violence. Students are sleeping in their cars, and they're even considering giving up their studies. There are workers of tomorrow. They have nowhere to sleep. And at the same time, Canada, with the support of the Conservatives, are giving $50 billion to oil and gas, which made egregious profits in 2022. How can we accept that? talking about progressiveness, Canada is one of the countries in the world where there's the highest number of women working. And why is this? Because we're talking about childcare workers. There was a visionary woman in Quebec, Pauline Marois. She created $5 a day daycare spots. And this allowed two things to happen. First of all, to allow women to have access to the labor market, as well as to ensure that Canada, there is the least child poverty in Quebec in Canada. This is not an us thing. We looked and saw that Canada is becoming more and more progressive. The National Daycare Program was adopted last year. Great. We can't be opposed to that. We already have it. Dental care, we're not opposed to that either. We already have it. We can't be against other programs either because we have it. All of the things that come from us in Quebec, the Bloc Québécois members were here, and we talked about the bills and the battles that have already been won in the past. They've already been won and waged. Quebec is taking Canada behind it like a ball and chain. We are prepared to move forward. We're prepared to see progress, but we're being slowed down all the time by Canada. Canada is just stalling, not moving forward. Inflation is out of control. There is a lot of problems for seniors. They're being abandoned. Climate change, we're not where we should be. There's no progress being made by Canada. So how do you want Quebecers, how do you expect Quebecers who are watching us and seeing the bills that we have and saying, how can they pass this? This hasn't been resolved yet. How can we trust this country? How can we want to be part of that country? Quebec workers who are looking at this and they're saying, hey, wait. Let's just say they didn't know about this situation and thought, well, scabs, why? Why is this still happening in Canada? How come this hasn't been fixed yet? No, it's not been solved yet. My colleague said it earlier. We tabled 11 bills on this subject. We've been talking about this for a long time. Every time the Liberals have blocked it, it makes no sense. And the government of Canada has to come into the 21st century and now protect workers. It's essential to give them some power in the relationship with the employers. It makes no sense otherwise. They have no negotiating or bargaining power. And I forgot to say this, but in Canada, we're the province where the highest rate of unions. It's in Quebec. We have understood the importance of standing together, of having unions, and ensuring that we're stronger together than alone against the employer. It's time to... We must move to questions and comments.
The Honourable Member for Guelph.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Maybe like you, I was so involved in listening to the Honourable Member, I was wanting him to go on. I wonder if he could maybe mention the recent impacts on the Port of Montreal and the labour disputes and how this legislation might help to add balance there so that we don't have prolonged disputes as we've recently seen in Montreal at the port.
The Honourable Member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. I will answer with another answer. At the Port of Quebec, in Quebec City right now, my colleague said it earlier, it's been 200 days now, 200 days that the workers can no longer take it and they have to find another job to continue with their negotiations. 200 days. How can this be acceptable in Canada? They don't have any power at all. This bill, I forgot to say this, but this bill will come into force only 18 months after royal assent. What could happen in 18 months' time? There could be a federal election. And what could happen if there's a federal election? The Conservatives, do you really think the Conservatives will vote in a bill that came from the NDP and then went to the Liberals? I don't think so.
Inside the honourable member for North Island Powell River.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for his speech, and I agree that we need to follow in Quebec and BC's leadership across this country and make sure that workers are protected. It's been very concerning for me to hear the Conservative rhetoric that somehow the workers are disrupting the flow of goods, which is absolutely shameful. When you think about the workers, what they're really doing is fighting for their rights to work collectively and make sure that they're safe. So I'm just wondering if this member could talk a little bit about why it's important for workers to have rights and what that does for the economy and for the good of all people when those unions are respected.
The honourable member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. I want to thank my colleague for the question. I think that I mentioned in my speech that respect for the rights of workers to bargain and the rights of workers to have power, the employees to have some power in their bargaining with employers, is the very essence of work and their relationships. And as she mentioned, if we want working conditions to be negotiated that are fair and to see that there is fairness in terms of what is happening right now with inflation, I think this is absolutely essential to resolve this issue. Thank you. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Trois-Rivières. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my colleague from Longueuil-Saint-Hubert for that passionate speech. I would like him to ask him a question that really bothers me. In December, I got a letter from an organization called the Artisans de la Paix, and they had lost a significant part of their budget. We see homeless people increasingly on the streets. There are many of them. It's very distressing. You can see it. I'd like to ask my colleague, when we see the letter from the Director General of these Artisans de la Paix, it seems very irresponsible to cut this program. What could I say to Robert Cardiff when it comes to this 3% cut? The honourable member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. I want to thank my colleague. He's raising a very important question, and I talked about it in my speech. It's shameful. It's shameful that the government will cut the only budget to help. I saw it. I traveled around last year, and I saw the tent cities and the families that were living in there. Single mothers with their kids were living in those tent cities. There were students in these tents. Other people sleeping in their cars. It makes no sense that we accept this. It's the middle of winter. The government is slashing. It might only be 3%, but we should be increasing this budget to fight homelessness. My colleague is right. I will come out soon with a report on this trip that I did around the province to look at this issue.
And comments? The Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Government House Leader, a brief question.
Yes, Madam Speaker. I'm wondering if my colleague can just provide his thoughts in regards to province of Quebec, province of British Columbia, now the federal government moving towards anti-scab legislation. If he can give his thoughts in regards to how this can actually provide national leadership, so hopefully other provinces will look at the legislation, what other provinces are doing, and look at bringing in more anti-scab legislation across the country.
The honourable member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert, 15 seconds. I would invite all the provinces in Canada to follow Quebec example. You will excuse me because it's not going so fast. I think in a few years, Quebecers will make another choice. So we don't have to keep fighting the same wars as in the past. We already know this in Quebec, and with Quebec's sovereignty, we'll be able to achieve this. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Debate, before resuming debate, my apologies. À l'ordre, conformément à
Pursuant to the Standing Order 38.